Chapter 5 From Bronze to Steel. What is smelting? As we have already noticed, man probably first learned the use of metals by accident, from the melting of copper out of rocks on which fires had been built. In some parts of the world, however, copper is found in an almost pure state. The Indians living near Lake Superior used to pick up pieces of this natural copper and hammer it into hatchets, knives, and ornaments. But most copper has to be melted out of rocks before it can be fashioned into things that are useful. This getting of metal out of rock is called smelting. Copper was an easy metal to smelt. The metal, while soft, could then be hammered into tools and weapons, or while still liquid, it could be poured into molds of stone which had been cut into the right shape. Then, when the metal had cooled and hardened, the different objects could be lifted out. Why was copper a poor tool material? The trouble with copper was that it did not have sufficient hardness and strength to make strong tools and weapons, and the sharp edges dulled quickly. But after a while, somebody discovered that by adding about 1/9 part of melted tin to the melted copper and thoroughly mixing them, a very much harder and stronger metal was produced. We call this mixed metal bronze. Bronze served the purpose so well that for many hundreds of years, nearly all the tools and weapons were made of it. We speak of that time as the Bronze Age. About the same time, man also discovered iron, but it was not much used then. There were a number of reasons for this. Iron was harder and stronger than other metals, but in most parts of the world it was difficult to break the ore out of the surrounding rocks. In order to melt the ore, a very hot fire was necessary, which required a great deal of fuel and had to be built in a stone furnace of special construction. Furthermore, most iron was full of impurities. It was hard to get these out, and if they were not taken out, the iron was not of much use. Why was iron better than bronze? But iron, when properly smelted, was vastly superior to bronze. It was so much harder and stronger and could be given a so much sharper edge, especially in the form of steel, that the people who used iron tools and weapons would have a great advantage. The widespread use of iron seems to have started with the ancient Egyptians. One reason for this may have been the fact that Africa, unlike Europe, was rich in deposits of a fine quality of iron that was easy to get out of the ground. Pieces of iron have been found in the pyramids of Egypt. The Egyptians also learned how to make steel. Gradually, the use of bronze for the more important tools and weapons was given up and iron took its place. A great step forward was taken in the history of making the world comfortable when the Bronze Age ended and the Iron Age began. The American Indians never learned the use of iron. Even the Aztecs and the Peruvians were still using copper when Columbus discovered America. Is steel more important than iron? Without the special kind of iron which we know as steel, the modern world could not have been born. Our great civilization of today is literally built on a foundation of steel. Steel is a much finer metal than ordinary iron. It is stronger and more elastic. It is not so brittle, and therefore it can stand a much heavier strain. And of course, it takes a much sharper edge. Swords made of the famous Damascus steel hundreds of years ago were so finely tempered that they could sever a delicate hair hanging in the air. Steel is made by taking the impurities out of iron and adding a little carbon and small quantities of certain other substances. Steelmaking was a slow and expensive operation until modern times. Then science came to the aid of industry and devised quicker and cheaper ways of making steel. Just how this was done, we shall see later. What were the first smelters like? As we have seen, for the smelting of iron, the ore had to be heated so hot that an ordinary fire was not sufficient. A special furnace had to be built. The earliest furnaces were made by digging a hole in a hillside and filling it with dry wood, on which the ore was placed. The hole was covered over except for an opening left in the top through which the hot gases, from impurities in the iron, and the smoke could escape into the air. There was another opening at the bottom so that a draft would blow through the furnace and make it hotter. Then some Thomas Edison of the ancient world invented an artificial furnace for making iron. It was built of stones on the surface of the ground so that it was no longer necessary to go to some hillside and dig into it. A strong blast of air was blown upon the fire with a bellows. The bellows was a bag made out of the skin of some animal, such as a goat. It was filled with air and then pressed down, the air being forced violently out through a small hole. When was coal used for smelting? Later, instead of wood, charcoal was used in smelting iron. But it took so much wood to make enough charcoal to run an iron furnace that iron smelting could not be done on a large scale until modern times, when coal came into use. Coke, which is obtained from coal, makes an extremely hot fire. Where there were great coal mines near good supplies of iron ore, iron and also steel could be produced in immense quantities at a low cost. The iron that was used by the Egyptians, the Greeks, the Romans, and in Europe down into the Middle Ages was wrought iron. That is, iron which, while still hot and fairly soft, was hammered into different shapes. Cast iron, which is iron poured into molds while still liquid, was made in very early times by the Chinese, but it did not appear in Europe until the 14th century. In order to make cast iron, a very high temperature is required, but cast iron is brittle and is not nearly so useful as steel. We must now look a little more closely into the making of steel. What is steel? Steel, as we have already noticed, is a combination of iron and carbon, together with very small quantities of other substances, such as silicon, manganese, sulfur, and phosphorus. The hardness of the steel is determined by the amount of carbon in it. There are also many special kinds of steel, made by combining other substances. The steel that was made by the people of the ancient world was simply tempered iron. The iron, while being smelted, absorbed a certain amount of carbon from the burning charcoal. Then the iron was made into the desired shape, and while still red hot, it was plunged into a bath of cold water, which gave it the qualities of steel. This was called tempering. What is a blast furnace? It was not until the beginning of modern times that real improvements began to be made in the manufacture of steel. First, the blast furnace was invented. In the blast furnace, a quantity of limestone was added to the charcoal and iron ore. Then, when the ore was melted in the strong heat, the impurities in the iron would combine with the limestone and melt, forming what is called a slag. The melted iron, being heavier than the slag, would run down to the bottom of the furnace, and the slag would float on top. The greatest difficulty in making iron and steel has been to get the impurities out, for iron ore is generally filled with all kinds of base substances that, if not removed, would make the iron almost worthless. Steel, particularly that used in making railroad rails, which have to stand a great strain, must be free from impurities. So the matter of getting out the impurities has been a serious problem. In 1740, Robert Huntsman in England produced the first crucible steel. The crude metal was placed in clay crucibles, melted, and refined. Fine steel was made in the crucibles, suitable for tools that required great hardness, a high polish, or sharp edges. Such steel, which is comparatively small in amount, is still made by the crucible method. What is the Bessemer process? An important new method of steel making appeared in about 1850. It was invented in the United States by a man named Kelly, and in England by a man named Bessemer, each working independently. It is generally known as the Bessemer process. It greatly shortened the time necessary for taking out impurities. For this process, huge containers called converters with open tops are used. They look something like enormous barrels held up by posts at the sides. A stream of air which is forced through the liquid metal carries away the impurities. What is the Open Hearth process? About the same time, there came into use the Open Hearth process. The ideas from which it sprang were worked out by Sir William Siemens in England, and by two brothers, P and E Martin, in France. The crude metal is placed in a furnace, the bed of which is lined with chemicals, and then a gas flame of terrific heat is sprayed over the surface. Our age has been called the Age of Steel. This is quite true, for modern civilization rests on machinery. Most of this machinery is made of steel, just as are the skeletons of our great skyscraper buildings, our huge bridges, all kinds of tools and implements, and rails for our railroads. Without the production of great quantities of steel, quickly and cheaply, the kind of world that we live in today, with all its comforts and conveniences, would be impossible. And Mother Nature has been kind to us. She has put into the earth such generous supplies of iron and coal that we need have no fear that they will all be used up in the near future.